What is going on, Slumpbusters? This is your boy Kyle, and we are back with another YouTube quick hitter. So, the University of Nebraska, they've been a punchline of college football going on about a half decade now, and they kept it semi-close against the University of Oklahoma. I mean, it was a game that could have been a bloodbath that sums up pretty much 20 years of Nebraska football, but Nebraska kept it close, and even if they're going to struggle to make a bowl game this year, they can walk away and say they covered the spread against Oklahoma. So what happened to the University of Nebraska? A program that was not that long ago a powerhouse across college football. Alabama before Alabama. In the 1990s, they won national championships in 1995, 1996, and 1998, including Tom Osborne's championships in 1970 and 1971. The University of Nebraska has been a powerhouse across college football for much of the 20th century. And since the turn of the 21st century, Nebraska has become just like everyone else, which happens in college football. The University of Miami went from being a powerhouse in the late 80s and early 2000s to now becoming a mediocre team that hangs around 8 or 9 wins every year. The University of Texas won championships in 2006 and hasn't done much since. USC, same boat. It happens in college football, but Nebraska feels like a particularly new case. And part of that is geographic location, part of that is the conference they play in, and part of it is the fault of Bo Pelini. But we'll get to all that in a second. Let's start out by going back to 1998. The University of Nebraska won their final national championship in Tom Osborne's last season as coach of Nebraska. But not only was it Tom Osborne leaving the University of Nebraska, who had run the Big 8 for 30 years and either finished first or second every single year for about 28 of those 30 years, but Nebraska was moving into a new conference of the Big 12. And the Big 12 was going to take the original Big 8 conference members, being Nebraska, Colorado, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, the Kansas teams, Iowa, and they were going to merge with schools in Texas, being Texas A&M, Baylor, and the University of Texas, along with the terrible Texas Tech Red Raiders. And so this new conference in the Big 12 now had all of the recruiting pools in Texas competing for the same recruits. And unfortunately now, Nebraska, which had never had a gigantic athletic budget, but had found ways to win thanks to Tom Osborne's recruiting tactics and the fact that they had been a dominant power for so long that they could then recruit the 4 and 5 stars from all across the Midwest. Now all of a sudden they were competing against the resources of Texas and Texas A&M and Oklahoma, all in the same conference. And as a result of this, the conference kind of just split up the powers a little bit. Oklahoma had a downtime for a while. Texas needed some time to rebuild their program under Mac Brown, and Nebraska, under their new head coach, replacing Tom Osborne, Frank Solich, ended up falling as well into this new conference of mediocrity. And so Frank Solich ends up winning a Fiesta Bowl in his second year, but after that, it feels like what happens a lot when these legendary coaches retire, is that there's about a 3-year gap where the system is still working its way out from where it was before. And so the University of Nebraska gets a new recruiting class post Tom Osborne, and they become pretty mediocre in the new Big 12 North Division. They go 7-7 one year, 10-3, before Frank Solich ends up getting fired after winning in the Alamo Bowl against Michigan State. And that year they finished 19th in the country. So they were still a respectable team, beating up on the Kansases and Iowas and Texas Techs of the world. But they were losing a lot of games against the University of Oklahoma, the University of Texas, and the University of Baylor. And so all of a sudden, Bill Callahan comes in around 2004, 2005, and is tasked with trying to bring the University of Nebraska back to its glory days. And Nebraska couldn't shake the powers of money and resources that were being invested in these Texas schools. Callahan gets them back to an Alamo Bowl. They win the division one year, but don't win the conference. And so they play in the Orange Bowl. They don't win that. They go to the Cotton Bowl. They go to the Gator Bowl. They win their division over some lesser teams, but they don't ever get to the level of Texas, who now becomes the powerhouse in the conference the way Nebraska was in the 90s. And so Bill Callahan gets fired after a 5-7 season, just the second time in 40 years that the University of Nebraska does not end up playing in a bowl game. And so then they hire Bo Pelini. And Bo Pelini has a revitalization of the University of Nebraska. Still a school that can't get over Texas. Now Oklahoma is building themselves into a powerhouse, and Texas A&M is always really, really good at the top of the conference. And so they do have a revitalization. Then Ndamukong Suh is the person that we remember dominating the lines of the Nebraska teams in the 2000s, but they could never quite get over the Alamo Bowl or going to 2 straight Holiday Bowls or playing in the Capital One Bowl. And then Nebraska moves during conference realignment to the Big Ten. And so this team that for a decade has been about what we anticipate the University of Miami to be now, they win about 8 or 9 games a year, maybe play in a conference championship. Now, Nebraska is leaving behind its roots and going to a conference that they don't traditionally play in. And as a result, they keep a lot of the same successes. Bo Pelini went 9-4, 10-4, 9-4, and 9-4 in his first 4 years at the Big Ten, because Nebraska still has those same recruiting bases. But what's also changing in college sports is there is no longer regional recruiting in college sports. Yes, the Texas, California, and Florida markets for recruiting are the best in terms of just the gigantic number of people. But in order to become a national powerhouse, you have to recruit nationally. And so Nebraska is already a hard enough place to pitch people to come to. The fact that they're now like the 7th best option in the conference they play for begins to spell doom for Nebraska football. And so Bo Pelini gets fired after a leaked tape of him berating a staffer at the University of Nebraska goes out. He ends up leaving the school, and they end up hiring Mike Riley from Oregon State. And Mike Riley is now fully entrenched in the Big Ten. There are new recruiting bases. There are new powerhouses in college football, including in their own conference, because Ohio State has now established themselves at the top of the Big Ten. Michigan has just hired Jim Harbaugh. Penn State has recovered from their scandal in 2012. Wisconsin has rebuilt their program. And so there's so many good teams in the Big Ten, along with Iowa. Of course, how could we forget about the 8 wins every year Iowa team with Kirk Ferentz? But still, there's a dominant group of teams in the Big Ten, and Nebraska finds themselves kind of just lost in the middle. What happens with Mike Riley is that the team totally falls off a table, is that under Mike Riley, the team just plummets to the bottom of the Big Ten. And this is the bottoming out that has concerned Nebraska fans and Nebraska players forever, because now you have to convince players, really talented players, to build something that does not exist in a place that nobody wants to go to. Think about it this way. If you're a recruit from the state of Texas and say that you have offers to go to Oklahoma, who is a powerhouse up the state, or the University of Texas or Texas A&M, those are your first choices. But say, for example, maybe Alabama doesn't come after you, or Oklahoma or Texas don't come after you. Well, if you're from Texas, you could go to TCU. They've had a solid record across the last 5 years. You could go to Baylor. They played in a Sugar Bowl not that long ago. You could even go to Oklahoma State, who's had 15 consecutive winning seasons under Mike Gundy. But say even those schools don't recruit you. Let's say that you're maybe a 3.5-star recruit. Well, if you really have to extend out of the state, and maybe you don't want to go to the Pac-12, you could look up and say, well, maybe Kansas State is a viable option. Kansas State's won 7 games across the last few years. Even if you have to go all the way further, even Missouri plays an SEC schedule. So even Missouri is a more desirable team than Nebraska. Yes, it was a money move to move to the Big Ten for Nebraska, but ultimately it makes them irrelevant in the Big 12 and SEC recruiting pools, which means Nebraska now has to go recruit the players that Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Iowa, even smaller schools like Northwestern have been recruiting for decades, and Nebraska just doesn't have a stronghold in those places. The Great Plains does not have a dominant football recruiting base, and so Nebraska looks up and says, where can we find recruits? And they're left with a Martinez at quarterback for 8 consecutive seasons because Nebraska takes what they can get. And the problem with taking what you can get along with not having tons of resources at your disposal, is that you find yourself falling by the wayside in college football without much hope of a turnaround anytime soon. And no amount of Scott Frost hires from UCF can turn around the Nebraska program, because it's a simple point of money, resources, and geographic location that now makes it so that you have to convince players who are really talented not only to come and play for a terrible team, but to also live in Nebraska and play a Big Ten schedule that's not really a Big Ten schedule, because you play in the Big Ten West against Illinois and Northwestern and Purdue and Wisconsin and Iowa. I don't see a turnaround anytime soon coming for Nebraska football, because at this point they've fallen far enough where college football has just kind of moved on from them. Maybe they'll have winning seasons again, but for now, Nebraska finds themselves on their way to a 5th consecutive bowlless season for a program that has pretty much evaporated in college football. Thanks for checking out this episode. You can follow the Slumpbuster on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and make sure to check out the Caveman Coffee Company. You guys can use the promo code SLUMP with the link in the description to this episode in order to get your discounts on these wonderful mocha cold brew blends.